A lot of this is about managing and displacing feelings of shame and weakness.
I think for Israel, Gaza Strip was always the id, or the S, like Freud called it. And this is the place where everything is allowed.
I'm not telling a romantic story because people are also capable of extraordinary destruction and so on. But it's how do we enhance and magnify that social eros, that desire to belong to one another.
You're listening to This Authoritarian Life, a podcast in which we explore everyday human stories to make sense of authoritarian politics. My name is Krzysztof Sombati.
And I'm Erdem Evren. This episode was sponsored by the Rosa-Luxemburg Stiftung and was produced in cooperation with the International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter-Strategies.
In the last episode, just as a recap, we already saw the emergence of emotions as playing a major role in political life. We looked at the example of Iran. We had two female guests, and they spoke of the importance of shame and fear before the Gina Revolution of 2022. And one of them also spoke about this pressure to conform and how it creates a double personality, forcing women to lead double lives in the private sphere and in the public sphere. So we already saw that these psychic energies play a really important role in kind of authoritarian dynamics and politics. And we thought we would have a closer look at those as drivers of authoritarianism. And, you know, this is not something especially or specifically new. 100 years ago, you had people from the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Fromm, who were already writing about the roots of the desire to obey and conform in that society, the bourgeois society of the early 20th century. And they found in patriarchy, basically, the roots of that fascism that emerged in the 20th century. And then other pioneering figures like Wilhelm Reich and Georges Bataille stressed that people actually desired fascism. Now, if we go to the contemporary moment, I see already many parallels, but also a few differences. And perhaps one of the things that we've noted with Erdem when we were preparing this episode is perhaps this protective register that contemporary authoritarians are playing on is not as important as it was in the 20s and 30s. It seems to be that the destructive energies, the destructive elements in contemporary right-wing politics is much more prominent. And not only is it more prominent, but it seemed to be more gratuitous. So in the 20s, violence was meant to be cleansing somehow as a force for bringing about a new society. And it seems that if you look at Trump, grab them by the point, or as Richard Seymour says, bring it on being kind of the motto of the moment. We see that these destructive energies are somehow just creating some kind of avenue for satisfaction. We want to address specifically that, how these destructive energies are not only present, but kind of gratuitously present. And to do that, we have two guests today, Iris Hefets, and the other is Richard Seymour, and we thought they would be great conversation partners. Erdem, do you want to present Richard first, and then I present Iris?
Sure. So Richard Seymour is a British author and commentator living in London. His blog, Lenin's Tomb, was at one point the most popular leftist blog in the world. And he has published several books, including The Meaning of David Cameron, American Insurgents, Corbyn, The Strange Birds of Radical Politics, The Twittering Machine, and The Disenchanted Earth, Reflections on Eco-Socialism and Barbarism. And his most recent book, which came out from Warsaw recently and which we'll discuss today, is Disaster Nationalism, The Downfall of Liberal Civilization. Welcome to This Authoritarian Life, Richard.
Thank you for having me.
And so I'll introduce our second guest, Iris Hefets, who's a psychoanalyst. She was born in Israel and studied psychoanalysis, which she practiced for many years. She edited the Kedma portal, a stage for Mizrahi discourse in Hebrew. And in 2002, she left Israel and has since been living in Berlin, where she also worked as a psychoanalyst. She's on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace, an organization which has been one of the most vocal critics of Israeli occupation of the West Bank and its blockade and later bombardment of Gaza. And she's known in Germany for staging a one-person protest in the Neukölln district of Berlin in response to Israel's punitive campaign against Gaza, also in response to the 7th of October attacks by Hamas.
So, Richard, on your blog, you were already kind of drawing from some psychoanalytical theory, engaging with Lacan, if I remember it correctly. But my sense is that in this latest book, in Disaster Nationalism, that kind of search, that kind of engagement is obviously very central. And to the extent that you kind of make it clear that only looking at, social deprivation, social inequality would not quite help us to understand the psychic force of collectivized hatred that you are interested in. So has there been a particular moment in your life that pushed you more in the direction of dealing with these psychic forces, with psychoanalysis, psychoanalytical theory?
Yeah, this really, for me, the engagement with psychoanalysis began with my own analysis. And that was prompted, I suppose, many factors, but one of them was the collapse of the political organization that I was a part of, the Socialist Workers' Party, the fact that they had covered up rape and, it was a real disaster. And many of us fell apart somewhat after that. And psychoanalysis is somewhere you can go to fall apart safely and work through some of that stuff. I think I read Bruce Fink's Clinical Introduction to Lacanian Psychoanalysis, decided that's for me, went in and started analysis, still going on now, 15, 16 years later, I don't know. And I started to find it a useful idiom for those parts of experience that don't fit into the rationalized picture of Marxism, those parts of life that are contradictory or in some ways downright irrational. So anyway, that's where that begins. I would say disaster nationalism, for what it's worth, I decided specifically not to use analysis as a kind of, in Lacanian terms, discourse of mastery. I didn't want to try and tie everything up in a neat theoretical bow and explain everything in terms of the unconscious or the death drive or jouissance or any of that stuff. I would use psychoanalysis where it was useful. But I think the key orienting point there is Freud's book, Civilization and Its Discontents, which for all its problems and all its, if I may put it like this, misanthropology, is actually framing a quite important question, which is that civilization puts incredible demands on us. And perhaps I could radicalize that analysis and use it to understand the present. So that's where that came from.
So you just mentioned Lacan and his concept of jouissance, which it's hard to translate, but so there's a satisfaction grounded in destructive energies. And it seems like disaster nationalism tries to do a survey of these. Can you speak a bit more about that? So specifically this element of satisfaction that is in contemporary public culture and how you see it?
Yeah, well, I think that's, in some ways, that's the most explicit and obvious thing about it. When Trump talks about grabbing the pussy, or when Modi is made into a sex symbol after a pogrom, and specifically because of his role in the pogrom. When, someone like Duterte talks about raping women, shooting them between the legs. When Bolsonaro talks about women who are too ugly to rape. All of this sort of stuff. And it's not always gendered, but frequently is, and frequently involves some sort of sexual transgression. There's, that's a jouissance-laden discourse. And indeed, part of the whole point about Trump, if you listen to his talks, his speeches, most of the time they're incredibly boring. For long periods of time, they're incredibly boring. But there are these libidinal highs. They don't make any sense. He just rambles and wanders without making any sense whatsoever. But there are these moments where the audience gets a kick out of it. Back in the day, it was lock her up, that kind of thing. And where he would cross the line, where he would say something that you weren't supposed to say. And it was more, in my opinion, than just a paltry rebellion against the liberal superego. This was really about trying to barbarize Moors. It was trying to legitimize and normalize a certain degree of violence against people who let's say, liberal strategies of recognition had sought to protect to some degree and within their obvious limits. So, yes, I mean, I think there are jouissances involved. I must say, though, I mean, I'm ambivalent about this category of jouissance for various reasons, but also I don't think it's specific to the right or anything. I mean, that's ubiquitous in politics. And the question is, how do you understand and analyze its role? I would say that what is particular to the right today is a generalized apprehension of decline, of loss, and of the threat of collapse, and specifically the collapse of a structured society based upon distinctions that provide a certain kind of ontological security, particularly for those who are doing relatively well. It's by and large people who, whether they're working class or middle class or bourgeois, they have experienced a crisis in their, or serial crises in their mode of being, and they've experienced relative trajectories of decline, probably for many years. So it's not just recent, this is something that's ongoing. And that chronic crisis is then punctuated by several acute crises, disasters. So, you can talk about COVID and the threat that brings. You can talk about wildfires, in Oregon, for example, which they decided was proof of an Antifa threat. They're setting fires to burn all the white people out of town. And you can talk about financial crises, recessions, things like that. So these big social crises conjoin with personal losses and personal senses of decline. And what the right does is offer you disaster of another kind. So they don't offer you social analysis. They don't offer you a systemic problem, because systemic problems are abstract and remote and difficult to deal with. They offer you a problem that you can kill. They offer you something to take arms against. And that is very animating and very seductive.
Coming to you, Iris. So how do you experience, maybe through your own work as a psychoanalyst, these destructive energies in everyday culture that Richard mentioned? I mean, he also talked about how Lacan and maybe Freud influenced him. So you could also say who influenced you when you're looking at these things.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm a child of Freudian and Kleinian psychoanalysis. So, and Melanie Klein was very busy describing destructive energies. Actually, she described it already before the Second World War, and she was not received very well because people thought, what is she talking about? And she talked about actually the psychotic baby that each one of us has. A baby who, when it's not breastfed, for example, or is very angry, he wants to annihilate the mother, or the breast, as she called it, and he is also afraid that the mother is going to kill him and to take revenge on him. And she used words also in German like as gazing, for example. These fantasies that people have, and we all have them, and these murderous impulses, which became actually reality in Germany. And she was received actually, or many years later in Germany, but when she left Berlin to London, she founded there a school where she found more resonance as for these aggressive descriptions. And in German society, already psychoanalysis was a revolution because, Freud came and saying, these nice creatures, children, are not so naive and not so nice. And also we as human beings, we are not what you see, these bourgeois people and all the others who are put away, all the hysterical women kind of. These are all part of us. And we all carry this actually... trieb. Sorry, I have it. Drives, and instincts, and we have these parts in us, which we tend actually to split and to say no. We are civilized people. We don't have it. So he introduced it into our life, our psyche, which is in our society, which is also a big, it was a narcissistic wound, as we call it, because, we like to think about ourselves, human beings, as the center of the world. And actually the sun is turning around us, and we know everything, and we are very civilized. So we see now big ruptures in that. And for me also as a Jew living in Berlin and in Germany, it was very helpful to try to understand where am I living, what is Germany, which ghosts are going here around, and which ghosts are also very active in the Israeli society where I came from, and where it was also a kind of taboo, the Jews, and still you see it in Germany, of course, the Jews are the pure victims. And if you're a victim, you are good by definition. So I guess I was very much influenced by that. And it helps me also to understand what's going on in Israel and in Germany and also in other places. I mean, in Europe and, of course, in the USA.
So, like the immediate context in which Richard talks about these destructive energies or the acceleration of these destructive energies in a way are like the financial crisis of 2008, the COVID pandemic, and in general the destruction of the ecosystems, the climate crisis, etc. In relation to the Israel, maybe, what was the context in the 70s, 80s, 90s that you think also accelerated these destructive forces that we are unfortunately seeing at this very moment?
Well, I would say that I think 1967 was very important for this kind of, it's of course, it's always processes, it's not just a point. But we used to call the war in June 1967 the 6 Days War. But actually it's a never-ending war. We are still now, I think, in this kind of war, which is not war now, it's a genocide. But this was, for Israel at least, a manic moment. But I think this moment was, okay, now we have also not only the support in Israel, not only the support of the Soviet Union or other sinking empires like England and French that helped Israel, or Israel helped them with 1956 with the war on the Suez Canal. It's also the United States. This is kind of the biggest empire, and that made the consciousness of Israel to have this feeling of we are great. So I think that was a moment, if we can speak about moments in the history of Israel, where this feeling of anything goes. We can do everything, and we don't have to pay for it at all. And we are allowed to do more and more and more, and we are allowed to have more colonies and more, and we see it until now, this impunity. So actually it's kind of, I would say psychoanalytically speaking, it's kind of killing of the superego. So there is we see it now that we see about international law. It's just, it doesn't exist. So we see a purely Id, I would say. And I think for Israel, Gaza Strip was always the Id, or the S, like Freud called it. And this is the place where everything is allowed. It looks like, pictures that we know from Bosch, from the hell. And this became reality. And this is end of civilization, when there is no clear border between fantasy and reality.
Yeah, you called in one of your interviews Israeli society as kind of resembling a psychotic patient. In this aspect of denial of reality, can you say a few more words about that and how that connects to contemporary events in Gaza?
Well, when I lived in Israel, I had the feeling that something is wrong. I couldn't really explain it in words. And also, I was born a bit before 1967. So this is what I know. This is the reality I know. And when I grew up, there was still contact between the West Bank and Gaza, and between Gaza and also other places. So I knew people from the Gaza Strip that were in my home as visitors. And with the time, I think that the Jewish society in Israel lost contact with reality, also with this idea of we can do everything. Nobody is stopping us, and we can fulfill every wish we have without any inhibition. But every time, one goes one step further. And for me, the turning point was 2008, 2009. That was the first time that Israel closed to the Gaza Strip for journalists, which means you don't have any observance instance. This is kind of killing of superego, because the press is there in order to report. And people, when they do something and they know people see me and they watch me, then I have to take care. I'm not allowed, there is kind of parent who I internalize, and if I do something wrong, then, my mother, my father, my aunt, my teacher is going to punish me. And there was no punishment. They just did it, and they could do whatever they wanted. And Israel used so much ammunition, which is now battle-probed, and they market it afterwards, white phosphorus. I mean, horrible things. That was the first time. When journalists are being killed, they are killing the superego in psychoanalytic thinking and knowledge. When you don't have a superego, you're entitled to do everything. And if you think that something bad is happening, then you project it on others. So it's not Israel who is attacked from the Gaza Strip because Israel made Gaza to a ghetto, actually. It's, it's the bad Gazan, it's the bad guys. And then comes the kind of projection of this is the bad place that we have to extinct. And this is what psychotic people are doing. They cannot deal with these parts of themselves who are so destructive. So they say, there is someone else who wants to kill me. There is someone else who's after me. It becomes afterwards reality, because, if you put people in ghetto, of course they want to kill you and to rebel and whatever. But in the beginning, it was not reality. It was the fantasy of Israel, and it made Israel to project on the Gaza Strip or Palestinians all the bad parts, to shoot them. But it was not in the fantasy, it became real. So it was kind of like a psychotic patient who is not treated, and every now and then has a psychotic episode, and he's bombing the other person because or society or whatever, because he thinks they are the bad guys who wants to kill me. And since it was not treated, we saw also that the intervals between these outbursts became all the time shorter and shorter, and the intensity of every attack on the Gaza Strip was higher. So the last attack before this genocide was before the election in November 2022. When Yair Lapid, who is kind of opposition in Israel, it's not an opposition actually, it's like my Israeli friends in the left, they say they have 50 shades of right wing in Israel. So he just bombed Gaza as a campaign for election campaign without even needing any cover story. There was any aggression from Gaza. He had to prove that he is also a general, because he wasn't. He was a reporter in the army, and he's not a general like Benjamin Netanyahu or Ehud Barak and whatever. So he just bombed them in order to prove, killed Palestinian for 2-3 days, something like that, just in order to have an election campaign.
Richard, do you connect to this analysis,
Yeah.
sitting from where you are in London?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, actually, one of the things that has struck me about Israeli conduct over the last year or so is there's a contradiction, because on the one hand, they want to brag, they want to shout it from the rooftop. On the other hand, they dare not tell the whole truth. We get videos of them committing war crimes and swaggering about it. But on the other hand, they keep their worst war crimes under wraps. And that tells me that their shamelessness is a bit of a cover story. It shouldn't be taken at face value. And actually, I think that's sort of characteristic with war crimes and situations like that. Like, for example, the perpetrators of My Lai. In order to adjust to the feelings of shame arising from their crimes, they doubled down. And they made it into a story about themselves. This is what I do. This is what I'm capable of. And actually, just generally, one of the things that you find with violent criminals, or with, say, for example, the RUF rebels in Sierra Leone or the genocidaires in Cambodia, again and again you find patterns of shame emerging in relation to their own actions. And by the way, shame, I should be clear, I'm not claiming that shame is a moral emotion necessarily. We can be made to feel shamed about being ugly, weak, etc. And quite often it's the feeling of being made to feel vulnerable and weak that precipitates the shame that one tries to suppress through violent outbursts. That's quite common with criminals. It's quite common with people who are involved in genocidal activities and torture. One of the things, though, is that it's a spiral. The more you kill, the more you're obliged to kill, because the more disfigured you become by what you've done. And I would say that's a general heuristic with which we can approach the far right today. We talked about jouissance, but I think really a lot of this, particularly when we're talking about MRAs, incels, people like that, a lot of this is about managing and displacing feelings of shame and weakness. And so you get this spiral where you provoke a sense of ontological crisis, of insecurity. And then you get this displays of omnipotence. You strut about, you murder, you swagger. And for a moment, the threat is gone. And you've secured your ontological security and superiority. And then, it comes back again. It reminds me a bit, actually, of phobias. I use this example in the book. Like, arachnophobia is not going to be cured no matter how many spiders you kill, because the spider is not the problem. And that's kind of what's going on here. We have these phobic objects that are being created for us, and it can feel very much like efficacy, like agency in the moment when you kill that phobic object. And then you're still frightened because the next one... And also, the more you kill, the more terrifying they become. The bigger and more monstrous they become. Because they have to bear all of your, what was just being said, all of your projected aggression. So, yes, I think that's a general pattern. I obviously agree that Israel has its specific trajectories rooted in the settler-colonial dynamic. But also, I was struck also when I was looking into this, some of Israel's patterns are a bit like some of the things we've seen in America and Europe in terms of the long-term shift to the right, the decomposition of a kind of post-war national utopia based on state corporatism, the introduction of neoliberalism, the collapse of unions, and the utter collapse of leftist cultures and labour, which scarcely existed but dominated the post-war era. We've seen that here. So there are aspects of this that are particular to Israel for sure, but there are aspects that are quite general.
Maybe I can connect to that. We haven't brought in another important author who I've taken a lot from, Wendy Brown, who talks about a culture of nihilism in connection to what you just said, Richard, basically the neoliberalization of Western societies. Both in relation to consumerism, just rampant consumer culture, but also in the sense of nihilism being perpetuated by our feeling of basically impotence as opposed to omnipotence, in the sense of not being able to change the predicament around us. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if is nihilism also a force that is driving these authoritarian or destructive dynamics?
Yes, I think that nihilism is a part of it, but I think there's another term which Wendy Brown uses, which is sociophobia, which is, this is very different from interwar fascism. And that's why if we do see a mature fascist threat emerge, it will be very different, because essentially they are extremely paranoid about any claim whatsoever that can be made by society against the property rights and personal space of the individual. Masks are muzzles, social distancing is communism, all of that sort of stuff. If you try and tell somebody you shouldn't be racist, you shouldn't be sexist, that's an outrageous and egregious infringement on their personal liberty, that kind of thing. And there's also, relatedly, a phobia about the state. So interwar fascism worshipped the state, right? It wasn't without contradiction, but nonetheless, the predominant affect was the state is to be worshipped. Today, while the far right always has a soft spot for the good guys within the state, they see as looking out for them, like the repressive apparatuses. QAnon thinks that Trump is going to save them. Prigozhin thought that Putin would bail out his men and stop him from having to carry out a coup. In Bolsonaro's case, the Bolsonaro supporters thought the army would bail them out and save them from communism, and so on and so on. There's this idea of the good guys. But when it comes to the medical and welfare reach of the state, they are extremely paranoid. They are terrified that their bodily integrity is going to be violated by, obviously anti-vax stuff almost literalizes the metaphor. So nihilism, and in response to that, a kind of DIY investigatory politics, conspiracy as a kind of way of trying to make an alternative sense, and then emerging an almost pseudo-Gnostic ideology where people get this wrong. They say it's about postmodernism, it's postmodern relativism. No such thing. These people absolutely do believe in the existence of a mind-blowing reality that can be discovered if only you look past all the illusions. If you can show that the moon landing didn't happen, that Obama's birth certificate wasn't real, that the Holocaust didn't happen, you are living in a simulacrum. Break through the simulacrum, and then you will get to this ultimate reality. That's their ultimate consolation. That's their fantasy. And the thing about fantasies, the thing about dreams, is that they have a tendency to come true, even if not in the way that you expect, because people act on dreams. That's why we saw the insurrection as a kind of trial run. That's why we saw the Reichsbürger plot and, the wannabe insurrection in Brazil. These are dreams that have been lingering for a long time. Sanguinary dreams waiting for the bloody outlet.
And then both of you talk about this as well. Like, still there is this sense of victimhood that never goes away, right?
Well, I would say I don't really buy this victimhood. I think Israel is putting a lot of conscious effort to stay victim. And also for other powers, it's really helpful when Israel is being depicted as a victim. This is something also that we know from, in psychoanalysis, in individuals that are being treated, but also in societies. If you're a victim and you live in this victimhood, then you develop an entitlement. You're entitled to do everything. And also before this genocide, Israel was working on describe or propagating itself as a victim with all these stories about beheaded babies and whatever, which were, we all know, stories that were supposed to prepare the at least the Western society for this genocide, because then say that then they are entitled to do everything.
Richard, turning to you, because I see a certain parallel there between 9/11 and the current events in Gaza, in the sense of there, again, in that moment in the U.S., it was a moment when the sense of invincibility of the U.S. as a major power, as a superpower, was also very severely kind of undermined or perhaps even pierced. So did that also spawn similar dynamics as Iris is describing? Or is that parallel just in my mind?
No, there's obviously a parallel there. The only thing I would say is the dynamic sounds a lot like what I saw growing up in Northern Ireland. Israeli politicians sound so much like unionist politicians in their brittle, belligerent, sanctified victimhood. Anything is possible. No amount of violence can really discredit our side. And so, different social formation and so on. But I would say that seems to be a general pattern in relations of oppression and particularly settler colonial dynamics and so on. In terms of 9/11 and the 7th of October, I think there was an attempt made by Western governments and Western media after the 7th of October attack to turn it into a post 9/11 situation. The immediate temper and character of official propaganda, the completely uncritical way in which Israeli politicians were allowed to say utterly demented things, deranged, inhuman things on television, and not challenged and not questioned. That, I think, was attempting to galvanize the kind of what Gilbert Ashkar referred to after 9/11 as narcissistic compassion for people like us, right? They're white. They're like us. We had the same discourse when Ukraine was invaded, although on a much lower level. But the discourse was, well, it's hard to believe that a country in Europe, mainly, not Iraq or somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, but a European country could experience this. So there was this attempt, but manifestly it didn't work. Within a week, London had seen tens of thousands of people out in the streets. There had been in America mass protests, particularly by the Jewish left. Quite important that they took the leadership here, because otherwise the culture would make it impossible. I think that actually, 9/11 was similar in one respect in that, yes, it punctured a sense of an ill-conceived and unearned sense of impunity and omnipotence. But on the other hand, it forced a lot of people's hands. It made a lot of people think. And a lot of people decided that they were going to become anti-war, anti-imperialist. A lot of people started reading books and learning about the history of empire. I remember this. I was only a young man. But I remember a lot of people who hadn't been political before, used to spend their Saturdays washing their cars in the suburbs. Suddenly they're politicized. Suddenly they're interested in Islamophobia, they're interested in the history of empire, and they're critical of American foreign policy. I think something like that has happened here again. A lot of people who previously would have been, I think the common sense would have been, of course there should be two states, 2 states, 2 people, that kind of thing. But just feeling like, it's all so complicated and a kind of fatalistic, this is really nothing to do with me anyway, it's so far away. I think that's changed things. I think a lot of people have developed an historical consciousness about this. And a lot of people are learning for the first time, what the Palestinians' predicament actually is.
I would just like to come back to one thing that Richard say, if I may, about the identification of European countries with the Jews in Israel because they are white. So Jews became white, actually, after they were killed. They were the blacks of Europe. And if you think about it psychoanalytically, the Jews were actually the faces of Europe. They were black or brown, they were stinking, they were dirty, they were the thing that you have to get rid of. And it is, the Jew that is staining the purity of the Christian tradition. Jesus is born, from Maria, who was Immacolata. She was not stained, there was no dirt there. There was not, the Jews brought this dirt and one has to get rid of them. But only in Israel, when the empires had this interest, they became suddenly white, and the Muslims are now the black of Europe. And I think in that sense there is this similarity of all the bad things are projected into the Muslims in Europe. Now they are the danger. In Germany they are also the anti-Semites and whatever. So it is just, you can evacuate all the things that you don't want to have in yourself into them.
Mm-hmm. So you have Israel, where you were born, raised, and lived for a long time, Iris, and then you left in 2002, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a society that seems to be locked in these cycles of violence, as you explained. And Richard, you just mentioned a society that came out, or partially at least, partially successfully from such a cycle. So I'm wondering what there is to learn from that. How do societies get locked into these cycles, and how can they come out of them? Richard, do you have any thoughts on this cycle of violence?
Sure. In terms of Northern Ireland, the difficulty there is that the IRA fought the British state to a standstill. And so the British state no longer particularly wanted Northern Ireland at that point, and that was why it was possible to have a peace. Remarkably quickly, the culture changed once the war was over. Once the war was over and there was some sort of settlement, then the stereotypes and prejudices and bigotries and hate kind of started to unwind. Not totally. I mean, it's still there. But, and a lot of people are nostalgic for the war because, you know, those great animating reservoirs of feeling that allowed people to feel happy and motivated and to have a sense of community, even if it's an exclusionary one. All that's gone now. And the shopping centre, the town centres are empty and the shopping centres are car parks out in the middle of nowhere. The barracks have been closed down, so that's unemployment. The big garrison-sized police stations have been taken down, so that's unemployment. You know, there's a kind of, what do we do now? And all you've got is kind of North Atlantic neoliberal capitalism. It's not much fun. So it's understandable some people would rather go back to war. And, well, some people are going back to war. We saw the pogroms in Britain over the summer against migrants. A lot of that happened in Belfast. A lot of that happened, and it was Catholics and Protestants together. So, you know, there's never any final sort of settlement, at least as long as we're living in oppressive societies, you know. Then I think just in terms of the solutions or the pointers, I mean, I'm not somebody who offers much in the way of solutions, to be fair. And that's partly because I think solutions can often be premature and a kind of a discourse of mastery. But one thing that I do make a point of saying is that it won't be enough to talk about bread and butter issues. There's a big illusion, I think, on the left that if we can just sort of get rid of all this stuff about identity and sexism and race and all that, and just focus on people's bread and butter needs, then everything, you know, most people support us on this, so we can win. I don't think that's going to work. And there's two reasons why I don't think that's going to work. First, because that strategy has been tried and tried and tried again. People often choose against their own material interests, so to speak. And in fact, sometimes they choose against survival. You know, in the Philippines, where Duterte and now Bongbong Marcos, his successor, ran these death squads, anti-drugs death squads, killing addicts and so on. Tens of thousands of people killed, journalists locked up, people tortured for being dissidents, you know, all sorts of things. When the people are asked, do you support Duterte, 90% at least say yes. When people are asked, do you support his drugs war, about 90% of people say yes. The same people, when asked, do you suspect or do you fear that you or someone you know could be killed by one of these death squads, 75% of people say yes. So they would rather take the risk. They would rather take the risk in order to clean up the streets as they see it and, you know, rebuild their sense of dignity by killing somebody who's come to represent dirt, matter out of place. So I argue that we need to talk about the passions, you know, and I go back to Marx's theory of needs, the theory of the passions and so on. But specifically, we like bread and butter, and we need bread and butter is good, but we don't love it, right? The things that you love are often things that require sacrifice. If you have children and you love your children, it is not because they give you more money, more energy, more free time, you know, more friendship. They take and they take and they take, right? I mean, I say this, I don't have children, I have a cat, and that's about as much as I can handle. But, you know, like people who have children, it's not the point that they satisfy your material interests. The point is that there is another human being that needs something from you, and you cannot but respond to that with love if you're a normal human being. So I think the question is, how do we activate that social eros? What, I mean, and this is the final point I would make about this. If you just talk about material interests and that stuff, how do you explain the people protesting for Gaza? Or the people who used to protest over Iraq or Afghanistan? These places are miles away. You know, you could comfortably live your life, probably, without suffering any drawback if you just ignored it. And now a lot of people do that. Well, I think fundamentally, if we think about what an interest is, it is an intentional relationship to the world. And a lot of people are unable to look away from vulnerability and frailty. because we all, we've all seen relatives die, people suffer, illness and so on. We all know of our own frailty, our own finitude, our own mortality. And if you, unless you've been thoroughly brainwashed by ideology, you look at what's happening in Gaza. How does this not make you want to do something? So this is what people are really like, and it's not necessarily. I'm not telling a romantic story, because people are also capable of extraordinary destruction and so on. But it's how do we enhance and magnify that social eros, that desire to belong to one another.
I can sign on that, because if one wants to get out of this, spiral of violence that we see now. We know in the past that it can happen after a big loss. It was like Nazi Germany after Stalingrad. It was clear that they are going to lose, but they couldn't stop. And they said, okay, now we are going to recruit the 17 years old. And now we have Enzig, and now also the youngers, and now also the maybe the sick people. So you cannot stop at some point unless you lose, and there is a bigger power who force you to lose, or at some point people have the feeling, maybe like in Vietnam, in the USA, this is such a big loss. And what are we doing that for? Actually, I mean, it's crazy to think, that in Vietnam that every person of the Viet Cong and whatever is going to invade into the USA and all the communists. So the moment there is this feeling of loss and that we are dependent on each other, that can bring us to a moment where we say, okay, I mean, we need to stop that. I don't think that Israel is capable psychically itself to stop it. It needs from the outside someone who comes with a super ego, with a international law, whatever, or some power say, I mean, we are not going to support it anymore. But I think it's important, and it's important also as for what I said about caring about things, and what you said, Richard, about taking care of children, for example. What totalitarian and authoritarian regimes are doing is what we call attacking links. So the moment, for example, you have a secret service like Stasi or whatever, you cannot trust other people. You start to be suspicious. You develop a paranoid atmosphere in which you are not connecting to other people, and it is, of course, against our human nature, and it puts us in a paranoid state of mind. And the idea of that is to really to ruin the human connection. And we see it also, now in Israel, when I see the people who grow up there, sometimes I see them, in the society also, and also professionally, you see people who are dissociating, who cannot really connect to others, who were soldiers, and they are soldiers in that sense that they do not feel. They just obey, they kill, and there is no feeling which is attached to that. There is no other. If I ask, for example, how was it in Gaza? I get sometimes answers of, it was fun because I was with my friends. And Palestinians, they don't even exist in this psyche, in this world. So the connection to the fact that this child that I killed, or this physician, could be my father, could be my child, this is totally dissociated. And the problem is that, when they leave Gaza and they go to sleep, sometimes they cannot dissociate anymore. So it becomes their own child that they are afraid to kill. But if you raise a generation of people who are soldiers in their psyche, then you can really go on like that for a very long time, which is a dangerous thing. Yeah.
Maybe a last question in relation to that, because I think, I think Richard's kind of last words could be the ending, but I want to come back to Gaza since it has been in the focus of our discussion. So if there's one thing that is happening within the community largely writ of Jews around the world, it is this new generation that we see protesting. Both of you have mentioned them on the streets in the US, but also in other countries. So that kind of conscience is coming from within the community. So even a psychotic kind of patient as you described Israeli society should be more open to those words, or am I wrong about that?
Well, what we see now is the apartheid generation, as I call them. And there is the apartheid generation in Israel, people who were just born into this apartheid. It's completely normal for them that they are the occupied territories, and it's far away. When I was in Israel, for example, I haven't been there for some years, but when I was there, it usually was the place where I was worryless. You live on a Titanic in this state of mind, and you don't, and therefore they were also very surprised from the 7th of October. If I'm far away and I can see that, I'm very worried, and I was also worried before, therefore I left. But you have this state of mind that it just, it's like, there is this story about two little fish that are swimming in the sea, and then comes an older fish, and he's asking them, well, how's the water today? And they look at him and they say, which water? So this is the water that Israelis, this apartheid generation, is swimming in. And I think the same generation in the USA is experiencing something else because, they go to schools which are not segregated like in Israel. They meet Palestinians, or in the university they meet Palestinians, they meet Arabs, they meet people from India, from Pakistan, from Global South. In Israel, you hardly meet that. It's a very segregated society. And then they go also, to Jewish schools, Sunday schools, and they see that there is kind of contradiction. They are being sent to Israel to birthright trips and whatever, and then say, wait, what's going on here? This is against everything that I saw and learned, and it was cultivated in the USA, in our bourgeois school and whatever. Israelis do not experience this contradiction. They swim really in this water, and they don't see, it's a turbid water now. So I think, therefore, we experience now also in a generational terms, I know of many young Jews in the States, in other places, less in Israel, who really have, they cannot speak with their parents, grandparents, because it's a big break. Also in other organizations, in societies, there are a lot of splits in these places because you cannot really bridge something like that. You cannot really now have a conversation of is a genocide is okay or not. Yeah.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you. So that's it from us for today. Thanks for listening. Goodbye. This episode was sponsored by the Rosa-Luxemburg Stiftung and was produced in cooperation with the International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter-Strategies.
We would also like to thank our contributors: music and mastering, Shai Levi; artwork and graphics, Polina Georgescu; editing, Vera Jonas; and our in-house communications advisor, Anna Szilágyi.